It started 3 years ago when I joined my cousin Jake and his friends on a hunting trip deep in the woods of Pennsylvania. I wasn't a seasoned hunter. I didn't even own a rifle. But Jake had been begging me for months to join. "It'll be fun," he said. "Nothing like bonding in the wilderness." He promised I wouldn't have to do much except tag along and soak in the experience. If only I'd known what I was walking into. We arrived at the cabin late Friday night. It was small, rustic, and isolated. There wasn't a soul around for miles. The guys, Jake, his best friend Carter, and this quiet guy named Luke, were already cracking open beers and laughing when we pulled up. Despite the warmth of their welcome, there was an eerie vibe about the place. The trees seemed too tall, the night too silent, as if the forest was listening. "Get a good look now," Carter joked, slapping me on the back. "Because once night falls, you might regret coming here." I laughed it off, but deep down, I felt a twinge of unease. The next morning, we geared up and headed into the woods just after dawn. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your face but fills your lungs with energy. We split into pairs. Jake and Carter went north while Luke and I headed south toward a clearing by the river. Luke was a man of few words, but I didn't mind. We trudged through the underbrush for about an hour before stopping to set up. He handed me binoculars and gestured for me to scan the area. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it wasn't moving. It stood between the trees, a tall, black figure with what looked like antlers. "Hey, Luke," I whispered, lowering the binoculars. "Do deer usually just stand like that?" He frowned and peered through his scope. Then he froze. "What is it?" I asked, but he didn't answer. Instead, he clicked the safety off his rifle and started backing away. "Luke, move," he hissed. I didn't argue. We started retreating the way we came, but the further we walked, the more I felt like we were being watched. The woods, once alive with birdsong and rustling leaves, had fallen deathly silent. When we finally met up with Jake and Carter, Luke didn't say a word about what we'd seen. He just shook his head and muttered something about the area being off. That night, back at the cabin, the tension was palpable. Luke sat by the window, his rifle propped against his knee, while Carter tried to lighten the mood with jokes. But even he seemed on edge. Then, just as we were about to turn in, there was a noise outside. It wasn't an animal. It was a sound I can only describe as a scream, but not human. High-pitched and guttural, like it echoed through the trees like it was coming from everywhere at once. Jake grabbed his flashlight and Carter grabbed his gun. Against my better judgment, I followed them onto the porch. The woods were dark, impossibly dark. The beam from Jake's flashlight barely pierced the shadows. "Probably just a fox," Carter said, but his voice wavered. Luke joined us, his face pale. "That's not a fox." We all stood there, listening. Then we heard it again, closer this time. That horrible, inhuman scream, and then the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting louder. "Get inside!" Jake shouted, slamming the door behind us. We locked every window and barricaded the door with furniture. No one said it out loud, but we all knew we weren't dealing with a bear or a coyote. This was something else. The screams continued throughout the night, each one closer than the last. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, clutching whatever weapons we had and waiting for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, the screaming stopped. We ventured outside to find the ground around the cabin littered with claw marks and strange symbols etched into the dirt. Carter tried to laugh it off, calling it a prank, but none of us believed him. Luke wanted to pack up and leave, but Jake insisted we stay. "That thing won't bother us during the day," he reasoned. I should have argued harder. We spent the day pretending everything was fine. Jake and Carter went back into the woods while Luke stayed behind to keep watch. I didn't stray far from the cabin, sticking to the clearing and trying to convince myself it was all just my imagination. That night, the screams came again, but this time they weren't outside. They were inside. The first scream came from Jake's room. We rushed in to find him thrashing in his bed, his eyes wide open but unseeing. His skin was cold, clammy, like he was in shock. "What the hell is happening?" Carter yelled, shaking him. Jake didn't respond. He just kept screaming, his voice raw and broken, until it suddenly stopped. He slumped forward, unconscious but alive. Then we heard it, the footsteps again. This time they were upstairs. "Impossible," Luke muttered. "There's no upstairs." He was right. The cabin was a single story. But the footsteps continued, echoing above us like something was pacing back and forth. We grabbed our guns and huddled together in the living room, too terrified to move. The footsteps eventually stopped, replaced by a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Then the door slammed open. I don't know how to describe what I saw. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent in ways that defied nature. Its face, or what I thought was its face, was a mess of shadows and glowing eyes. It didn't move, but I swear it was staring right at me. Carter fired his rifle and the thing vanished, leaving behind a blast of icy wind that knocked us off our feet. We didn't wait for morning. We grabbed Jake, threw our stuff into the truck, and drove until the sun came up. We never talked about what happened. Not really. Jake recovered physically but refused to go hunting again. Luke moved out of state, and Carter, well, he stopped joking around after that trip. As for me, I haven't been back to the woods since. I don't know what we saw out there, but I know it wasn't natural, and sometimes late at night I still hear that scream. It's faint, just a whisper on the wind. But it's enough to remind me that some things are better left alone.
Story number 2.
It was a hunting trip we'd been planning for months, a weekend escape to a remote section of Montana's wilderness. Just me, my older brother Travis, and our childhood friend Nate. This wasn't our first hunting trip together, but it was the furthest we'd ever gone from civilization. We arrived late Friday evening, setting up camp near a small stagnant pond surrounded by towering pines. There was no cell service, no trails, and no sign of other hunters. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first day went by uneventfully. We scouted the area, hiked a few miles, and set up some blinds near a deer trail. By sunset, we hadn't seen much except a few rabbits and the occasional distant rustle of leaves. That night, sitting around the fire, Nate started talking about a local legend he'd read online. "You guys ever hear about the Grey Wanderer?" he asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Travis rolled his eyes. "Oh, here we go. What is it, some kind of Bigfoot story?" Nate grinned. "Not exactly. They say it's a spirit, or maybe a demon, that lives in these woods. Hunters who stay here too long start seeing it. It doesn't hurt you right away. It just watches, follows, until... Until what?" I asked, despite myself. Nate shrugged. "Until you disappear. Some say it drags you into the woods, others say you just lose your mind and wander off." "Creepy," I muttered, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. Travis laughed. "Man, you've got an overactive imagination." But Nate wasn't laughing. Around midnight, we turned in, crawling into our separate tents. The night was cold, the kind that bites through even the thickest sleeping bag. I just started to doze off when I heard it, a low, hollow whistle drifting through the trees. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was too deliberate, too steady. 3 notes, repeated over and over. I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Travis? Nate?" I whispered, but neither of them answered. The whistle grew louder, closer. My skin crawled as I realized it wasn't coming from any particular direction. It seemed to be all around us, as if the forest itself was singing. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the freezing night. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light over the campsite. Nate was already outside, clutching a flashlight and looking pale. "You hear it too?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I said. "Where's Travis?" We turned toward his tent, but before we could call out, the whistle stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Then we heard the scream. It came from deep in the woods, a raw, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard either. Nate and I froze, our eyes locked. "Travis?" I called out, my voice shaking. The scream came again, this time closer. Without thinking, we grabbed our rifles and headed toward the sound. The beam from Nate's flashlight cut through the darkness, but the trees seemed to close in around us, their branches clawing at our faces and clothes. "Travis!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Then we saw him, or at least we thought we did. About 20 yards ahead, a figure stood between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be Travis, and its limbs seemed unnaturally long. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like embers smoldering in a dying fire. Nate raised his rifle. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The figure didn't move. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed deeper into the woods. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something about the way it moved, jerky, almost insect-like, held me in place. Nate fired a warning shot, the crack of the rifle echoing through the forest, but when the smoke cleared, the figure was gone. We spun around, our hearts pounding, but the woods were silent again. "Let's go back," Nate whispered, his voice trembling. We turned to head back to camp, but the path was gone. Somehow, in our panic, we'd gotten turned around. The trees looked the same in every direction, their gnarled branches looming like twisted fingers. And then the whistle started again. It was louder now, sharper, and it seemed to echo inside my skull. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. Nate dropped his flashlight, his face contorted in pain. "We need to move," I said, grabbing his arm. We stumbled through the dark, tripping over roots and rocks until we finally saw a faint orange glow in the distance. The fire. Relief flooded through me as we burst back into the campsite. But something was wrong. Travis's tent was empty, the fabric slashed open as if by claws. His rifle lay on the ground, bent and broken, and around the fire were footprints, huge, clawed prints that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. And then we saw it. Standing just beyond the edge of the firelight was the figure. Only now it was closer. I could see its face, or rather the lack of one. Its head was smooth and featureless, except for those glowing eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. It tilted its head as if studying us, and then it reached out a long, spindly arm. "Travis!" I screamed, but there was no response. Nate raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, the figure let out a sound, a deep, guttural growl that shook the ground beneath our feet, and then it vanished. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire, clutching our rifles and jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, we packed up and left, abandoning most of our gear in our haste. We never found Travis. The authorities searched for weeks but found no trace of him, not even a footprint. Nate and I never spoke about what happened that night, not really. We couldn't. How do you explain something like that to anyone who wasn't there? But sometimes late at night I hear the whistle again. It's faint, drifting on the wind, but it always comes from the same direction, the woods. And I know deep down that it's still out there, waiting.
Story number 3.
We always joked that the old hunting lodge was cursed. It had been abandoned for decades, sitting deep in the heart of Wyoming's forest. Overgrown trails, sagging roof, windows shattered by time and storms. But every year our group, me, my brother Ethan, and our friends Kyle and Ben, used it as our hunting base. It was tradition. Ethan was the one who always brushed off the rumors. People in the nearby town claimed hunters who stayed there would vanish, their rifles left rusting in the dirt, their packs untouched. He'd laugh and say, "It's just stories to keep kids from playing out here." But this time, I wish we'd listened. We arrived at the lodge late Friday evening. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, the sky bruised with the last colors of sunset. As we unloaded the truck, Kyle nudged me. "Check it out," he said, pointing toward the lodge. In the fading light, it looked different. The wood, usually gray and rotting, seemed darker, almost black. The windows, once jagged with broken glass, were gone. Just empty, gaping holes. "Wind probably knocked them out," Ethan said, brushing it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Inside, the lodge was just as decrepit as I remembered. Dusty furniture, peeling wallpaper, the faint stench of mildew. We lit a fire in the crumbling hearth and cracked open a few beers, trying to settle in. By midnight, we were swapping ghost stories like usual. Ethan, as always, played the skeptic, rolling his eyes at every creepy tale. But then Ben said something that made the room go still. "You guys ever hear about the Whisperer?" Kyle laughed nervously. "That's not a real thing." Ben shrugged. "Maybe. But my grandpa swore by it, said it was an old spirit that lived in these woods. It calls out to people, mimicking voices, leading them away. Once you follow, you're gone." Ethan snorted. "Oh, come on." But I noticed Kyle shifting uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the windows. Ben leaned forward, lowering his voice. He said the whisperer only comes if you're alone. If you hear it, don't answer, no matter what. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the walls, and every creak of the old wood sounded like footsteps. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint voice just outside the lodge. "Hey," it said, soft but unmistakable. "Come out here." It was Ethan's voice. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, heart hammering. Across the room, Ethan was sound asleep, his snores cutting through the stillness. The voice came again, more insistent. "Come on, it's me. I need your help." I clutched my flashlight, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, but I couldn't ignore the rising panic in my chest. Then, as suddenly as it started, the voice stopped. Morning couldn't come fast enough. Over breakfast, I told the others what I'd heard. Ethan laughed it off, of course, but Kyle and Ben looked uneasy. We spent the day hunting, splitting into pairs as usual, me with Ethan, Kyle with Ben. By the time we regrouped at dusk, our haul was pitiful, a single rabbit and no signs of deer. The woods felt empty, eerily so, as if every living thing had fled. Back at the lodge, we cooked dinner and tried to shake off the unease. Ethan cracked jokes trying to lighten the mood, but the tension lingered. Then Ben went outside to grab more firewood. He didn't come back. At first, we thought he was just taking his time, but after 20 minutes, Kyle got worried. "I'm going to check on him," he said, grabbing a flashlight. Ethan and I followed, the three of us stepping into the cold night. The moon cast long shadows across the clearing, and the forest loomed around us, silent and still. "Ben," Kyle called out, his voice cutting through the darkness. No response. We searched the area, our flashlights sweeping through the trees, but there was no sign of him. The firewood pile was untouched. Then we heard it. "Help me," Ben's voice called from deeper in the woods. Kyle took off running before we could stop him. "Ben, where are you?" "Kyle, wait," I shouted, but he was already gone, swallowed by the trees. Ethan and I hesitated, fear rooting us in place. Then the voice came again, closer this time. "Help me, please." It wasn't Ben's voice anymore. It sounded warped, distorted, like someone trying to imitate him, but getting it wrong. Ethan grabbed my arm, his bravado finally cracking. "We need to get back to the lodge." We ran, slamming the door shut behind us and barricading it with whatever we could find. The fire flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Hours passed. Neither Kyle nor Ben came back. Around midnight, the voices started again. First Ben's, then Kyle's, then others. Voices we didn't recognize. They circled the lodge, calling out, whispering, sometimes screaming. Ethan paced the room, muttering curses under his breath. I sat by the fire, clutching my rifle and praying for dawn. At some point, the whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought we were safe. Then the doorknob started to turn. I froze, my grip tightening on the rifle. Ethan raised his flashlight, his face pale. "Ben," he called out. There was no response, just the slow, deliberate creak of the doorknob turning. "Don't open it," I hissed. But Ethan didn't listen. He stepped forward, reaching for the door. Before I could stop him, it swung open. And there it was. It wasn't Ben, or Kyle, or anything human. It stood hunched in the doorway, its body impossibly thin, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, featureless, except for a gaping black hole where its mouth should be. The thing tilted its head as if studying us, and then it spoke. "Come with me," it said in Ben's voice. Ethan screamed, firing his rifle, but the thing didn't flinch. It stepped into the room, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette on invisible strings. I don't remember how I managed to grab Ethan and run. All I know is that we didn't stop until the lodge was far behind us. We found the truck at dawn, miraculously intact. Neither of us said a word as we drove back to town, our hands shaking, our clothes soaked with sweat. We never saw Kyle or Ben again. The authorities searched for weeks, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no bodies, just an abandoned lodge in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes I still hear their voices. "Help me," they whisper. "It's me. Don't leave me out here." But I know better now. I don't answer.
Story number 4.
The last time I saw my cousin Danny alive was the night before he disappeared. Danny and I had grown up together, bonded over our shared love of hunting and the outdoors. When he suggested we take a trip to Deadman's Hollow in West Virginia, I didn't hesitate. The place was notorious for ghost stories, hunters who vanished, strange lights in the woods, the works. Danny thought it was all nonsense. "It's just a hunting spot like any other," he'd said with a shrug. But as soon as we arrived, I knew something was off. The hollow was eerily quiet, not even the chirp of a bird or the rustle of a squirrel. The forest seemed darker than it should have been, the towering trees twisting into unnatural shapes. "Creepy, huh?" Danny said with a grin, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Perfect place to bag a buck. I forced a laugh, but unease prickled at the back of my neck. We set up camp near a shallow creek, unpacking our gear as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night came fast and heavy, swallowing the landscape in shadows. By the time we lit the fire, I was already regretting coming. As we ate, Danny started telling a story he'd read online. "Apparently, there's something called the Watcher out here," he said, his voice low and dramatic. "They say it's not an animal, not a person. It just watches, stalks you. And if you see it, you're already dead." I rolled my eyes. "You trying to scare me?" Danny laughed. "Maybe. But hey, if you hear a whistle, don't follow it." "Why not?" "Because that's how it lures you in." The way he said it, half joking but half serious, sent a chill down my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fire crackled low, casting flickering light across our tents. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my pulse quicken. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint whistle drifting through the trees. At first, I thought it was Danny, but when I peeked out of my tent, he was fast asleep, his face illuminated by the dying fire. The whistle came again, closer this time. It wasn't a melody, just a single shrill note that cut through the silence like a blade. I sat frozen, every instinct screaming at me to stay put. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the firelight, just barely visible between the trees. It was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadow. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, my body paralyzed by fear. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it turned and disappeared into the woods. I spent the rest of the night clutching my rifle, unable to sleep. By morning, I was ready to leave. But Danny, of course, wasn't. "Come on, it's just a deer or something," he said, brushing off my fear. We didn't come all this way to bail on the first day. Against my better judgment, I stayed. We spent the day tracking, moving deeper into the hollow. The deeper we went, the stranger the forest became. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark scarred with deep, jagged lines. The air felt heavy, thick with a silence that pressed against my ears. By late afternoon, we still hadn't seen any sign of game. Danny was frustrated, muttering curses under his breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As the sun dipped low, Danny spotted something, a deer, standing motionless at the edge of a clearing. "Finally," he whispered, raising his rifle. But something about the deer was wrong. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, its fur patchy and matted. Its head turned slowly toward us, and I swear its eyes weren't right. Too big, too human. "Danny, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. He fired, the crack of the rifle echoing through the forest. The deer didn't move. Then it stood up, not on its hind legs like a bear might. It unfolded, its limbs stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. The thing that had been a deer turned toward us, its face splitting into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged, too long teeth. "Run!" I screamed, but Danny was frozen, staring at the thing in horror. I grabbed his arm, dragging him back toward the camp. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees blurring together into a wall of shadow. Behind us, the thing let out a sound, a low, guttural growl that made my stomach turn. We didn't stop until we reached the camp, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding. "Pack up," I said, fumbling with my gear. "We're leaving. Now." Danny didn't argue, but as we packed, the whistling started again. This time it was louder, more insistent, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. And then it spoke. "Danny!" A voice called from the woods. It was my voice. Danny froze, his eyes wide. "Don't listen to it," I said, grabbing his arm. But the voice came again, softer, pleading. "Danny, help me. I'm hurt." I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his grip tightened on his rifle. "Danny, it's not me," I shouted, but he was already stepping toward the trees. The voice called again, and Danny disappeared into the shadows. I ran after him, my flashlight cutting through the dark. "Danny!" I yelled, but there was no response. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees twisting and closing in around me. The air grew colder, the whistling louder, until it felt like it was coming from inside my head. And then I saw him. Danny stood in a clearing, his back to me. His rifle dangled from one hand, his head tilted as if listening. "Danny," I said, stepping closer. He turned slowly, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty black sockets. His mouth stretched into a twisted smile, his teeth stained red. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice distant, hollow. And then he was gone. The thing that had been Danny melted into the shadows, leaving me alone in the silent, suffocating dark. I don't remember how I made it out of the hollow. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling into the parking lot of a gas station, my clothes torn, my face streaked with dirt and tears. The search party found no trace of Danny. I wish I could say I don't hear the whistle anymore, but I do, every night just outside my window, and sometimes I hear his voice. "It's beautiful," he whispers.
Story number 5.
I didn't want to go on that hunting trip. When my friend Marcus suggested it, I made every excuse in the book. Work deadlines, a bad knee, even a fake family commitment. But Marcus wasn't buying it. "Come on, Luke," he said, grinning over his beer. "You've been moping around for months. It'll do you good to get out into the woods, clear your head." Maybe he was right. My divorce had left me bitter, angry, and isolated. But something about the trip made my skin crawl. Marcus wanted to head to Black Ridge, an isolated forest in Montana. Locals called it cursed. Old wives' tales, Marcus had said, waving off my concerns. A bunch of superstitious nonsense. I wish I'd listened to my gut. The drive out to Black Ridge was uneventful. Marcus was in high spirits, cracking jokes and blasting music. I tried to match his energy, but the unease gnawed at me. As we got closer, the dense forest seemed to rise like a wall, the trees thick and dark, their branches twisted like grasping hands. Perfect hunting territory, Marcus said, his excitement palpable. We parked the truck at the edge of an old logging trail and hiked into the woods, carrying our rifles and supplies. By the time we reached the clearing, Marcus had scouted on a map. The sun was dipping below the horizon. The clearing was beautiful, in a stark, eerie way. Tall grass swayed in the breeze, surrounded by towering pines. We set up camp, lit a fire, and settled in for the night. Marcus was his usual self, telling stories and laughing, but I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. The forest was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart race. "Relax, man," Marcus said, noticing my tension. "You're just not used to being out here." Maybe he was right. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of movement outside the tent. I froze, straining to hear. It was faint, a soft rustling like footsteps in the grass. My first thought was a deer, maybe a fox. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. "Marcus," I whispered, shaking him awake. "What?" he mumbled, groggy and annoyed. "Listen," I said, my voice barely audible. He sat up, holding his breath. The growl came again, louder this time. Marcus grabbed his rifle, motioning for me to stay quiet. We unzipped the tent slowly, stepping out into the cold night. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. "See anything?" I whispered. Marcus shook his head, his eyes scanning the tree line. And then we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes just beyond the firelight. They were too high off the ground to be an animal. Whatever it was tall, impossibly tall, and it didn't blink. Marcus raised his rifle. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the stillness. The eyes didn't move. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the thing stepped closer, its massive form emerging from the shadows. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its torso too thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Its face was featureless, except for a wide, toothless mouth that hung open, emitting a sound somewhere between a growl and a moan. "Shoot it!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. Marcus fired. The gunshot rang out, deafening in the silence. The thing didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a high-pitched wail that made my ears bleed. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, while Marcus fired again and again. The thing moved, not like a person or an animal, but like a broken puppet, jerking and twisting as it approached. Marcus grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "Run!" he shouted. We bolted into the woods, the beam of Marcus's flashlight bouncing wildly as we stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind us, the wailing grew louder, closer. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually the sound faded. We collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Marcus whispered, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. We sat there in silence, too scared to move. The forest around us felt alive, like it was watching, waiting. "We can't stay here," Marcus said finally. We started walking, trying to find our way back to the truck. But the woods seemed to stretch endlessly, every tree looking the same. Then the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer. Faint voices, calling our names. "Luke," a voice whispered from the darkness. It sounded like my ex-wife. "Don't listen to it," Marcus said, gripping my arm. "Marcus," another voice called, deeper, familiar. It was his father, who'd been dead for 3 years. Marcus froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Marcus, it's me," the voice said. "I need your help." "Don't," I shouted, but it was too late. Marcus stepped toward the voice, his movements slow, almost mechanical. "Marcus, stop!" I grabbed his arm, but he shook me off with surprising strength. The flashlight fell from his hand, casting wild shadows as it hit the ground. "Dad?" Marcus whispered, disappearing in the trees. I screamed his name, but he didn't look back. I stood there, paralyzed, torn between following him and running. Then I heard the wail again, louder than before, echoing through the forest. I grabbed the flashlight and ran. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. The truck was where we'd left it, a beacon of salvation in the pre-dawn light. I waited for hours, calling Marcus's name, but he never came back. When I finally drove into town, the sheriff didn't believe me. "People get lost in Black Ridge all the time," he said, shaking his head. "We'll send out a search party, but I wouldn't hold out hope." They never found Marcus. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice calling to me. "Luke, it's me. I need your help. But I know better now. I don't answer."
Story number 6.
I didn't believe the stories about Blue Creek until I experienced it for myself. I grew up in a small, sleepy town surrounded by dense woods. Hunting was a rite of passage, a way to bond with family and friends, but no one hunted near Blue Creek. The creek had a reputation. Hunters went missing. Animals wouldn't drink from its waters. Locals whispered about a curse, but no one could say exactly what it was. My dad called it superstition for cowards and avoided the topic. When I turned 21, my best friend Tyler and I decided to test the legend. We were young, cocky, and tired of hearing people say, "Stay away from the creek." It was a crisp October morning when we set out, rifles slung over our shoulders. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, bird calls, and the distant chatter of squirrels. We hiked for hours, following the map until we reached Blue Creek. The moment we saw it, the forest fell silent. The creek was narrow, winding through the trees like a dark vein. The water wasn't blue at all. It was black, reflective, like a polished stone. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Looks normal to me," Tyler said, forcing a laugh. I didn't respond. The unease I felt was unlike anything I'd experienced before. We set up camp a few hundred yards from the creek. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows stretched long and dark, swallowing the light. Tyler tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes and telling stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Around midnight, I woke to a sound, a faint splash like something stepping into the creek. "Tyler," I whispered, nudging him awake. "What is it?" he mumbled. "Listen." The sound came again, louder this time. Splash, splash, splash. Tyler grabbed his flashlight, flicking it on. We unzipped the tent and stepped out, rifles in hand. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the creek. It was empty. "Probably just a deer," Tyler said, but his voice wavered. We stood there for a moment, scanning the woods before retreating back to the tent. But I couldn't sleep. An hour later, the sound returned. This time it wasn't splashing, it was footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our campsite. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Tyler nodded, his face pale. We sat there in silence, clutching our rifles as the footsteps grew louder. Suddenly, they stopped, and then came the whispering. It was faint at first, like the wind brushing through the trees, but it grew louder, clearer, multiple voices overlapping, speaking words I couldn't understand. "What the hell is that?" Tyler hissed. "I don't know," I whispered back. The whispering grew closer, surrounding us. Tyler snapped, grabbing his flashlight and unzipping the tent. "Stop," I said, but he was already outside. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The whispering stopped. "See?" Tyler said, turning to me. "It's nothing." Then something moved. A figure stood at the edge of the creek, just barely visible in the flashlight's beam. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted, his voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It stepped forward back into the light, and I felt my stomach drop. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tightly over sharp bones. Its eyes were hollow pits, and its mouth, if you could call it that, was a jagged black hole that seemed to suck in the light around it. "Run!" I whispered. But Tyler raised his rifle, aiming at the thing. "Tyler, don't!" I shouted. He fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the woods, but the thing didn't move. It just stood there, staring at us with those empty, blithe, hollow eyes. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Tyler's arm. We bolted into the woods, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly as we stumbled through the darkness. Behind us, the whispering started again, louder, more frantic. I don't know how long we ran, but eventually we stopped, gasping for breath. "Did we lose it?" Tyler asked, his voice trembling. Before I could answer, the whispering stopped. The silence worse than the noise. "Tyler," I said, my voice shaking, "we have to keep moving." But he was staring at something behind me, his face pale with terror. I turned slowly, and there it was, the thing from the creek, standing just a few feet away. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, a suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. Tyler raised his rifle again, but before he could fire, the thing lunged at him. It moved impossibly fast, its limbs twisting and bending as it tackled him to the ground. "Tyler!" I screamed, raising my own rifle, but I couldn't get a clear shot. The thing let out a sound, a low, guttural moan that vibrated in my bones. Tyler was screaming, thrashing as things' limbs wrapped around him like a spider catching its prey. I didn't think. I just ran. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more desperate. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me. Eventually, I saw it, the faint glow of my truck's headlights in the distance. I sprinted toward it, throwing myself into the driver's seat and locking the doors. I waited there, trembling, as the forest fell silent. Tyler never came out of those woods. The search party found his rifle, his flashlight, and his shredded backpack near the creek, but no trace of him. I moved out of that town shortly after, but Blue Creek haunts me to this day. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering again.
Story number 7.
The hunting cabin had been in my family for generations, nestled deep in the Appalachian wilderness. My father used to take me there every fall, teaching me how to track deer, set traps, and respect the forest. After he passed, I avoided the place. Too many memories, too much grief. But last October, my brother David convinced me to return. "It'll be good for us," he said. "Dad wouldn't want us to let it rot." So we packed up the truck and drove out there, just the two of us. It had been years since I'd been back, but the cabin looked the same, weathered but sturdy, perched on the edge of a dense thicket of trees. The first couple of days were peaceful. We hunted during the day, drank whiskey by the fire at night, and reminisced about Dad. It felt good to be there again, like I was reconnecting with a piece of myself I'd lost. Then came the third night. The forest felt off. It started with the silence. Normally, the woods were alive with sound, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But that night, it was as if the forest had gone mute. "Do you hear that?" I asked David, breaking the quiet. "Hear what?" he said, poking at the fire. "Exactly, nothing," he shrugged. "Maybe a storm's coming. Animals always get quiet before bad weather." But the sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright. I couldn't shake the unease. Around midnight, we heard it. A faint knocking, like someone rapping on wood. "Probably a woodpecker," David said, but even he sounded uncertain. The knocking came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the trees. It was coming from the cabin wall. David grabbed his flashlight and opened the door. "Hello?" he called into the darkness. The beam of the flashlight swept across the clearing, revealing nothing but shadows. "Must have been the wind," he said to Favre, but his grip on the flashlight tightened. We went back inside, bolting the door behind us. The knocking didn't stop. It moved around the cabin, from one wall to the next, steady and deliberate. David grabbed his rifle, and I did the same. "Whoever it is, they better leave now," David shouted. The knocking stopped. We stood there, rifles in hand, staring at the door. The silence was worse than the noise. Then came the scratching. It started at the windows, faint at first, like nails scraping against the glass. Then it grew louder, more frantic, moving from one window to the next. "Should we check it out?" I whispered. David shook his head. "Stay here. I'll look." Before I could protest, he threw open the door and stepped outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. "Do you see anything?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. "David?" I stepped onto the porch, gripping my rifle tightly. David was standing at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. "David!" I shouted, running to his side. When I reached him, I saw what he was looking at. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the pale moonlight. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its head was tilted to the side, as if studying us. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. David didn't answer. He raised his rifle, aiming at the figure. "Don't," I said, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. He fired. The crack of the gunshot echoed through the forest, and the figure vanished. "Did you see where it went?" David asked, his voice shaking. "No," I said, my heart pounding. We stood there, scanning the woods, but the figure was gone. "Let's get inside," David said. We bolted the door and sat by the fire, rifles within reach. Neither of us slept. The next day, we decided to cut the trip short. As we packed up our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's hurry," David said, glancing nervously at the tree line. We loaded the truck and started down the narrow dirt road that wound through the forest. The cabin disappeared behind us, but the unease didn't. About a mile down the road, we saw it. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, blocking our path. "Is that the same thing?" I whispered. David didn't answer. He slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop. The figure didn't move. "Back up," I said, panic rising in my chest. David threw the truck into reverse, but before he could hit the gas, the figure disappeared. "What the hell is going on?" David shouted. "I don't know." The road stretched on, empty and silent. David put the truck in drive and sped forward, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. I kept my eyes on the woods, expecting the figure to reappear at any moment. Then the truck stalled. "Are you kidding me?" David said, slamming his fist against the dashboard. He turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. "We have to walk," he said, grabbing his rifle. "No way," I said. "We can't leave the truck." "We don't have a choice," he said. We stepped out, the forest pressing in around us. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel. Then came the whispering. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct. "Do you hear that?" David asked, his voice trembling. I nodded, too scared to speak. The whispers seemed to come from all around us, overlapping voices speaking words I couldn't understand. "Keep moving," David said, his voice shaking. But then the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. "Where is it?" David whispered, gripping his rifle. I turned, scanning the woods, and that's when I saw it. The figure was standing just a few feet away, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "David," I whispered, but he was already aiming his rifle. Before he could fire, the figure lunged. It moved faster than anything I'd ever seen, its long limbs twisting unnaturally as it closed the distance. David screamed as it grabbed him, dragging him into the trees. "David!" I shouted, raising my rifle, but I couldn't get a clear shot. The whispers grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out his screams. I ran. I don't know how I made it out of those woods. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was rising. I flagged down a passing car and told them everything, but no one believed me. David was never found. The cabin is still there, rotting away in the forest, but I'll never go back. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the figure standing in the trees, watching, waiting, and I hear the whispers.